Blog Talk Radio.
Uh-oh, guess what day it is?
Julie.
Huh?
Julie.
Huh? Guess what day it is?
Guess what day it is? Guess what day it is?
Anybody? Anybody?
Mike.
Huh?
What day is it, Mike?
Huh? Woo-hoo!
Leslie, guess what today is? Leslie, guess what today is?
It's hump day.
Hump day!
It's hump day.
Hump day!
Yeah, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tom Donelson with the Donelson Files. My co-host, CoCo Konski. She is still moving from Glendale, LA to Burbank. So, and from everything I see so far, the move is going pretty well. It's her and her boyfriend moving by themselves, and they are moving into a slightly bigger apartment. So it'll be kind of an interesting listen to how she loves her new apartment next week, but she will be back next week. I am Tom Donelson. I am the chairman of America's PAC. I am also the project director and research associate for America's Majority Foundation, the author of 8 books, including The Rise of National Populism and Democratic Socialism, What Our Response Should Be, one of the top books for the 2016 election, and with lessons to go for 2020. So if you want to get an idea of what's going on going into the 2020 election and the trends, well, it's a valid book just because I basically, a lot of the trends I discuss, I pretty much nailed in 2016, and they're still in effect today. Tonight's guest is Wilfred Reilly. He is a professor at Kentucky State University, and we're going to kind of talk about simple things. He just did a study on lockdown versus those states who didn't use lockdown, kind of do have a comparison. And we've been, over the past, like I said, last night we've been looking at the data. And I'm going to make a case that the problem I see right now is that with the COVID virus is that basically we're basing a lot on data that no longer, in my view, is applicable. And we need to be looking at the most updated data, and Professor Reilly will be one of those. In addition, Professor Reilly has also written a book called Taboo, and we're going to kind of spend the last segment and he's going to try to talk about some of the things he wrote in the book. And down the road, I hope to get him on for a little bit longer discussion of that. So, first of all, Professor, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Good to be here.
Yeah. All right, first of all, kind of give folks a kind of a background of yourself.
All right. I'm always tempted to make jokes when people ask that, like I'm a Capricorn, I like homebrew and beer, that kind of thing. But I'm an associate professor of politics at Kentucky State University. I also teach some of our law enforcement courses, by which I mean criminal justice, counterintelligence, that kind of thing. By background, I have a law degree from the University of Illinois and a PhD in political science from Southern Illinois University. And kind of in my recent professional career, I'm the author of 3 books, The $50 Million Question, which looks at how people value things like race and religion, Hate Crime Hoax, which looks at the undisputed fact that a lot of these high-profile, recent, quote-unquote, racial incidents on both the left and the hard right, if you're talking about Jussie Smollett, for example, coming to the Catholic, have turned out to be complete fakes. And Taboo, the 10 facts you can't talk about, which breaks down the empirical evidence around some of these movements like Black Lives Matter, and often finds that they're talking nonsense. There isn't a great deal of evidence. And I'm on the show today to discuss a piece I wrote that gained a good deal more attention than I expected it to. It was kind of a dry mathematical piece. But for Spike, the large British men's magazine that compared COVID-19 case and death rates in states and countries that chose to just practice social distancing and sort of trust people to follow the rules as versus those that actually went with a hard lockdown. And what I found, and I think, Tom, what you wanted to talk about, is that there were actually fewer cases in those states that simply chose to pursue social distancing for a bunch of reasons, people outside in the healthy air and so on. But that's a little bit of my background. I'm a politics and CJ professor at one of the Midwestern state universities. And I do, in fact, like brewing beer, and am actually a Capricorn.
Well, here's the thing, because I have to be honest, I was intrigued by your study because, we've been, one of the things, we've been studying, and you brought this up in your study. One of the things I said about 8 weeks ago, I kind of stated this 8 weeks ago. I said, when you start looking at mild cases in the asymptomatic, don't be surprised if we're going to be looking at a 0.1 to 1% fatality rate overall. And that's exactly what we're seeing. It's across the board. I mean, we're seeing 0.1 to 0.8 depending. I know Australia's done a study. There was one in Austria, Lancet. New York did a couple of studies, one in the city, one for the entire state. California's got 2 or 3. Massachusetts got 1. Germany's got 1. And they're going about 0.1 to about 0.8%. Yeah, I kind of asked the question. And my question I've always asked people is, okay, do you shut down the economy based on that data? And I've gotten a mixture of answers, but it's a question that, I think, in your lockdown, you kind of looked at the same thing. And so, I mean, that's like my first question is this work? Do you shut down the entire economy based on those numbers? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and ask you, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question, and I mean you summarized that really well. So the way we would say this in social science is that there was a denominator problem in terms of COVID-19 early on. So very early on, and this is actually what shut down not just our country, but most of the world's powerhouse countries. I mean, Britain, Germany, Japan. The issue was that we had these estimates of incredibly high fatality rates for COVID-19. So we saw a guy named Neil Ferguson estimate that the overall IFR, as you would phrase it, for the disease would be 1% or a bit higher. The infection rate would be 80%, and what he called light mitigation wouldn't do much good. And that was at kind of the lower end of the spectrum. The WHO, the World Health Organization, sometimes jokingly called the CHO these days, they estimated there'd be a 3.5% fatality rate for COVID-19. Dr. Fauci, our health expert, estimated, I believe, 2.6%. The problem with this is that almost all of these estimates, except perhaps Ferguson's, were coming from the actual test results that we were seeing for the disease. And the problem with that is that was an extremely selected pool of people. So it was very, very difficult until about 3 weeks ago when the Trump administration really ramped up testing to get a COVID-19 test as a healthy adult. I'm an executive at my university as well as a professor, and because of some of the meetings I go to, I asked my doctor for one about 2 months back. And his comment was, quote unquote, hell no, Reilly, I'm not going to waste a test on you. You're 35, used to be an athlete, go to work. No. Although most of my work at the time was teleworking, to be frank. But in general, in most states, Kentucky was very typical. You were able to get a test if you were, 1, sick and symptomatic, 2, you had been in direct contact with someone who provably had COVID-19, and for a while our hospitals were calling that person and verifying. And 3, you were willing to call a hospital and go through this scary sort of 40-minute qualifying process of getting approved to go in and get dying, frankly, at this 3 and 4% rate, and we can't forget that. We're sort of influential, very sick, older seniors in most areas, and that's where you were getting 3 or 4%. That WHO figure came, I believe, from infected Europe, Italy and Spain, although that could be incorrect. But many people speculated early on, there's a guy named John Ioannidis from Stanford that did some good work on this, that the actual pool of people, all the guys like me that were told to stay home for a week, had to be 40 or 50 times the pool of people that were formally officially tested. And when we started doing what are called large-end serological studies, and you named most of the major ones. I mean, we did a study in Denmark, not we, but the government of Denmark did a study. They found the actual IFR for the disease, i.e. all of the infected versus all of the dead, was 0.21%. We did one in Miami where we went through everything from quote-unquote hood neighborhoods to the condos on the beach, randomly tested people. 7% had already had the bug. The IFR was 0.15% there in America, where I frankly think we have slightly better health care than they do in most of Europe. Germany, pretty much the same results, 0.3% in Bonn, the skiing region of the country. 15% of people already had the disease, by the way. So as we see these tests of whole populations, we are seeing IFRs, as they're called, between, I'd agree, pretty much 0.1 and 0.7%, rather than the initial 0.3 or 3% and 4% that were used to shut down the global economy.
Yeah. Hold on to that, Professor Reilly. This is Tom Donelson with Professor Wilfred Reilly on the Donelson Files on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
A boy born in Joplin, Missouri was fascinated by anything with wheels and a motor. The odds of him going on to fascinate millions with his talent? 1 in 260,000. The odds of this born racer having 157 career top 10 finishes in NASCAR? 1 in 125 billion. But every driver seeks the pinnacle of their achievements. The odds of him winning both the Daytona 500 and the Brickyard 400 in the same year? 1 in 195 million. The odds of a child being diagnosed with autism? 1 in 88. I'm NASCAR driver Jamie McMurray, and my niece has autism. Learn more at autismspeaks.org/signs. Early diagnosis can make a lifetime of difference. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
Yep. Okay. So once again, this is Tom Donelson with the Donelson Files. My co-host CoCo Konski is off for the week as she moves into her new apartment with her boyfriend, but she'll be back next week, and I'll trust you, she'll be ready to rock and roll. Because I know she just sent me a message saying, I'm ready to rock and roll when I get back, Tom. I hope you are. Files on the Batchelor News Radio Network, and let's go back. Okay, we're now talking about the data, and I'm, the 0.1, 0.7. And go ahead and continue your train of thought there.
Sure, I was actually almost done with it, but essentially the point was that for a long time it was hard to take a COVID-19 test. And we were seeing these terrifying figures of 3%, 4% coming from the pool of people that had tested. But that was almost entirely sick, influential, older people. When we started doing these random tests, for example, of everyone who went to certain ski resorts in Germany, which obviously would include many seniors, but also many young athletes, Denmark's test was literally everyone to give blood in the country. I mean, an incredible random sample there. We started seeing IFRs, as they're called, of about 0.2%. And to put that in context, the IFR for flu is 0.12%. So we're seeing something that's more serious, but we're also seeing that many, many governments seem to have simply panicked. And to some extent, I think there are individual people that are responsible for that. This certainly isn't a sort of get a rope statement. But I mean, Neil Ferguson, for example, wrote a very famous paper in this arena that caused several governments, certainly Britain's, to shut down. There was specific information from specific Chinese ministers that came into the WHO that caused governments to shut down. So I want to see what in business or the military would be called an after-action report on this, where we look at who got what information and made which decisions, because, I mean, trillions of dollars were lost here.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, because we had, like, John Hinderaker of Powerlaw blog and the Center for American Experiment and his chief economist, John Falo, to talk about this. And one of the, and during the conversation, I made the point, because when I looked at Ferguson's numbers for the U.S., the first thing popped in my mind was the Spanish flu, because if you would have taken it on a per capita basis, the 2 million would have equaled what the Spanish flu would have killed on a per capita basis. I mean, that's what we would have seen. And I've always thought to myself, how much, again, I've not yet read anything, but the numbers are almost identical to what we would have seen had we had the same mortality rate of the Spanish flu with the population we have today, because remember, like 650,000 died in the Spanish flu in 1919, 1920. And that was with a population 1/3 of what we have today. So obviously you multiply by 3 and you're going to get close to 2 million. And I've always thought to myself, how much did that influence? Plus, in the case of Ferguson, he models which were just as bad as this one. But
sure.
but I've always thought to myself, to this day, I wonder how much he just simply looked at the Spanish flu, looked at the mortality rate of the Spanish flu, equated the two, and that was his model. And that's what he based his model on. Now, I've not read that, but when you get those kind of numbers almost equal, it makes me kind of wonder. It certainly, that's the point. And so let's go back to your study.
Okay.
First of all, number one, what was the result of your study?
Sure. So the study itself was, to some extent, I think I'm a good social scientist, but this is one of my simpler pieces. This is written for an intelligent but popular audience. So what I did was, at the baseline, just take those U.S. states that didn't shut down and compare them to the U.S. states that did. One of the things people forget, because there's been so much media focus on quote-unquote heroes like Cuomo that chose to shut down their states, is that 8 or 9 of the larger U.S. states never shut down. I mean, these were fairly good-sized states. I mean, Utah did not shut down. Nebraska did not. Oklahoma did not. I'd argue South Carolina did not. Arkansas did not. Also some smaller players, South Dakota. So there were fairly explicit arguments. I mean, The Atlantic ran a headline called "The South Experiment in Human Sacrifice," as I recall. Talking about this.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, there were damned explicit arguments that these states were going to be not 5% better, not 5% worse, but kind of chock full of bodies in the streets, and we all read them. So I was interested first in whether that was true. So at the most baseline level, I took these 9 big states that didn't shut down, and I compared them to the states that shut down in terms of COVID-19 cases and deaths. And there were not substantially more COVID-19 cases and deaths in the states that didn't shut down. In fact, there were less to a statistically significant degree, as I recall. So next, I wanted to be fair, so I adjusted for population. I mean, Utah and South Carolina and so on are big, but they're not as big as New York. I got the exact same result. Again, in terms of cases per million, unfortunately many in both groups, but there were actually fewer to a statistically significant degree in the social distancing rather than the lockdown states. And you can posit why this is. I mean, a counter-argument to me, and I respect it as potentially valid, is, well, if you were hit harder with the same population, maybe you were more likely to lock down. An argument from my side, though, would be maybe if you encourage social distancing, people are more likely to keep to that rule, to follow that rule, rather than to follow it 70% of the time and then binge at Walmart 4 times a week and then go through the drive-thru. But whatever the case, even when you adjusted for population, there was no difference in case rates or death rates. At least it was significant. And I want to emphasize, in fact, that the lockdown states averaged more than 50 deaths per million, whereas the social distancing states averaged less than 20 deaths per million. So not only are you not talking about a significant gap, and not only are you talking about a small number in both cases, you're talking about advantage the social distancing states. Then I ran what's called a regression model, and obviously I assume most of your listeners are familiar, but the dependent variable is just number of deaths. And I looked at most of the things that we've talked about in this debate, population density, median age in the state, minority population percentage in the state, since we've heard blacks and Hispanics are being hit harder. That was totally insignificant. Income in the state, and the strategy of lockdown versus shutdown. And again, I found that lockdown versus shutdown was completely insignificant. The things that had an influence were essentially population and density, and not even density reached full standard statistical significance. But essentially, if you have more people, you don't need complex math for this. If you have more people and they're packed more tightly together and there's a disease outbreak, things are going to go harder for you whether you, A, mandate mask wearing and an enhanced level of politeness, or B, you actually lock the doors. That was the key variable. Having green space, having private cars, having open roads, beaches, that was what seemed to keep people safe. It wasn't whether the strategy was masking up or locking down.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because you also did, if I'm not mistaken, did you also kind of did numbers without New York?
Oh, yeah.
As well.
Yeah, now that's something, by the way, this gets into, so I think this is something that may be my next popular piece, I guess you could say. I mean, that's something I might pitch to, say, The Spectator. But I think there are 3 elephants in the room about COVID-19 that people just don't bring up. One, you brought up and summarized, but that is we now know the IFR is a 10th what we were told it was. You're really not supposed to say that because people think it would encourage sort of stupid behavior, people licking lamp poles or whatnot. In reality, all it's going to encourage people to do is put on a light mask and go outside. But IFR is not what we thought it was. That's Elephant 1. Elephant 2 is what I'm getting into here, which is that this is an incredibly age-specific disease. The average age of a COVID victim in the USA is 81. So, I mean, there are 59 total victims nationally. You can check this out on the CDC website, under 25. Maybe that's under 26. Yeah. And third is social distancing seems to work about as well. You can argue 5% either way as locking down. But this gets us back to New York. I took New York out of the model because it's such an extraordinary outlier. So I ran all my models with and without New York, certainly all the crosstabs and most of the regressions. The reason for this is that something like a third of all COVID-19 deaths in the USA, I'm not going to commit to that figure day by day, come from New York. And that, by the way, I'm not saying that this was due to any sort of malicious intent. I think he probably is a good man in the moral sense I would discuss with my priest. But this is because of Mr. Cuomo's decision to take seniors that were infected with COVID-19 and return them to nursing homes. The majority of deaths, no, not the majority, the 45% plurality of deaths in the USA have come out of the nursing home sector. As I understand, in New York, it's fairly close to that figure, and they have, again, something like a third of the national deaths. So because of that huge, unfortunate concentration of deaths in New York, I wanted to look at what factors were the most important without New York in the model. And the short answer is whether or not you look at New York, it doesn't much matter. The strategy used by the state still doesn't matter. New York, in fact, was a lockdown state. So using New York in the model actually is, I mean, it's an argument for my position, but even with New York out, you just move to New Jersey being the hardest hit state. Lockdown versus shutdown still does not matter. Population is still the most effective variable. But it is worth noting, these deaths are incredibly concentrated. I mean, a third of them nationally are in New York. Almost half of them nationally are in nursing homes.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point because here's, because one of the discussions we had last night was, okay, Minnesota, this, and John Hinderaker and John Pelham, they live in Minnesota, and John Hinderaker was making a point. He said, you would think every day they show up with the latest report, and it's the same thing. 80% of the people who are died, in Minnesota, were in nursing homes.
Yes.
And there's a part of me that says, well, if that's the case, what, it seems to me should you be putting your resources in that area? And certainly one of the things about Florida, I mean, a lot of places, Ron Dancini has been criticized, and he was one of those people who was looked at as the next mass murderer. But the first thing he did was he went to the nursing homes and he basically said, we're going to test people like crazy. If you got the COVID, we're going to get you out of that nursing home. And their death rates, in particular among nursing homes, have been significantly lower. And they've had a significantly lower overall death rate. So, versus some of the other major states. The only, and so to me, I'm thinking, if you got this problem, and that 90% of the people who are going to, let's say, die or end up hospitalized are going to be a selected age with selected comorbidity, it's the old saying, why do I rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Well, what, where are the dead, who are the people dying at higher numbers and who are the people, it would be a logical sense, these are the people you concentrate on first to see if you can reduce the overall death rate.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think really, and just a quick comment here, but we keep seeing these sideline stories in the media that are designed to make certain states, especially red states, look bad. I mean, you see, for example, in Wisconsin, they open the bars. So you've seen these pictures of people, and most of them are social distancing, but enjoying these, 24-ounce mugs of thick Wisconsin beer and making jokes and, watching the Packers get ready to practice and this sort of thing. The reality of this is that almost none of those people are going to die. I mean, the average age of those people that I've seen in those bars is probably about 25. And again, we've seen a total of 59 deaths under 25 in the country. So Governor DeSantis, I think, responded to this pretty well in that if you have, in Minnesota, for example, your figure is correct. It's 83% as of yesterday of your deaths coming out of nursing homes. There's probably nothing better you can do then test frequently for COVID among nursing home staff, for example. I'm going to give some suggestions here. Or give nursing home staff a bonus if they're willing to stay in the nursing home for periods of, say, 2 weeks at a time. Or prevent all non-medical visits to nursing homes. All of these things perhaps have some entities like the churches in a city organize food deliveries to seniors that happen to be living alone so they don't have to leave their home and take that risk. I mean, all of these things were discussed.
Yeah, you hold on to that thought right there. We're going to take a break. This is Tom Donelson on the Donelson Files on the Batchelor News Radio Network with our special guest, Professor Wilfred Reilly from Kentucky State University.
Go, Caleb! Come on, hit a homer, Jesse!
Let's go, guys!
Hey, did you guys know that kids who play sports earn more money when they grow up?
Of course. I knew that.
Hey, did you guys know that kids who read books have a bigger vocabulary?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Wow, jinx. Did you guys know that friendly children have more friends?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
That's true. I knew that. Did you guys know that winter babies are better at music?
Everyone knows that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, pretty obvious.
Yeah, so obvious. Oh, hey, guys, did you know that most people think they're using the right car seat for their kid, but they're not?
Huh, didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure I knew that.
I'm pretty sure you didn't.
Parents who really know it all know for sure that their child is in the right car seat at the right age and size. Visit safercar.gov/the-right-seat to make sure your child is protected. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Blocker Talk with Barry Bonds. Barry, where you can hear the NFL stars of tomorrow today. Listen to Barry every Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on blogtalkradio.com and the podcast every Monday through Friday at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time on thebatchelornews.airtime.pro. And if you're interested in having your own show or advertising on any of our shows, email us at labachelor40@gmail.com. And Bachelor is spelled BATCHELOR 40@gmail.com. Listen and stay informed. And this is Donelson Files with Tom Donelson and Wilfred Reilly as our special guest. And we're going to go back to you. You know, we're talking about what advice one should get, and we started talking about beginning with nursing homes, concentrating efforts in nursing homes. So go ahead and just keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This again, so what I talked about is this concept of almost an essay idea, but more important, something. I mean, you and I both have some influence. I mean, you can actually make a difference just talking about. But this concept of the elephants that people don't discuss about COVID, the IFR is a lot lower than we were told it was by the quote unquote experts. One, the disease targets almost entirely old people too. I mean, there's got to be a nicer way to say that, but the average age of a victim is 81. Half of the deaths come out of nursing homes. So Governor DeSantis, whatever you might think of that last Florida race with him against Gillum and all the stuff that went on either side, I mean, he's done a good job at these nursing homes. That's a good place to start. And third, social distancing works. We're now seeing that. That was the point of my piece. Those are things that are kind of just not discussed when you hear people, including a very surprising number of upper middle class women for whatever reason, running around sort of screaming, stay home, save lives. A lot of my fiance's friends would fall into this group. But at any rate, I think the focus on nursing homes is the place to begin, and I think there are very practical approaches there. Banning all non-medical visits comes to mind. Giving staff the equivalent of hazard pay to stay in those homes for periods of, say, a week without a break. For seniors that aren't in nursing homes, having entities like churches organize delivery of food and medical needs. They're very practical things that were proposed by a lot of, for whatever reason, mostly centrist and conservative men's groups as part of a senior quarantine when this began. The idea was, well, if this is going to be concentrated among the elderly, as most coronavirus deaths are, if you're talking about colds and flus, why don't we quarantine seniors? And the immediate response was, well, there's civil liberties issues with that. We don't know if this will be a disease primarily of the elderly. Ferguson very famously projected a 1% IFR across everyone. I don't know if he age-sectioned at all. And that idea kind of went away. And what we now know is that 90% of those to die are over the age of 60, according to the CDC. That figure's right on their website. So we can differ on how to define senior citizen, but it turned out that sort of half-joking early statement was almost exactly right.
Well, here's the other thing, because there's because I want to kind of warn people, because you're going to see a lot more of misuse of life balance statistics. As an example, I think you used this as an example where in 1 week, Wyoming jumped 250% in deaths.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, as you stated, it was 2 deaths to 7.
Yeah. So there's a very old saying, there are lies, damned lies in statistics when people talk in business and politics. So one of the criticisms of my article was, well, you're being too simple here. You're talking to an audience of educated laymen, and you're just using these sort of raw numbers. Why don't you use what's called R0 or R0 log? Why don't you use some of these more complicated figures? So R0, and I understand this is technically an incorrect description of what I'm about to describe in terms of the labeling, but R0 would be the weekly increase or decrease in the rate of infection or death state by state. So, for example, something that people pointed out to me after they read my article is, one of the social distancing states that you praise as having a very low number of deaths actually has an R0 of 400%. It was 250% 1 week, and then it was 400% the next week. How do you justify that, Doc? And I was a little concerned. You don't want to get people killed with loose talk. So I looked at the state that was being discussed. It was Wyoming. The reason that the state had an R0 of 250% 1 week is that the total number of deaths jumped from 2 to 7. So the increase of 5 from 2 in 1 week means that 250% as many people died in week 2 as in week 1. That gives you an increase of 250% if you want to get into this sort of numbers play. And then the next week, if you go from 7 to 20 or whatnot, that is an increase of 400%. The problem with this argument is that, as I understand, deaths have been stabilized for something like 3 weeks, which would place the R0 at 0. So I don't really see a point in playing a lot of these games. I mean, to me, the important thing is that the total number of deaths in Wyoming probably still haven't gone past 20. The plain fact is that if you look at the number of deaths in the USA, it's not far above 90,000 3 months into this, and a third of them are in New York State. So we haven't seen this vast epidemic that's killing millions of people sweeping through the country. In a typical bad flu season, you see 60,000 deaths. In half of a year of COVID, we've seen 90,000 deaths, and the average person that died is 81. I fully concede that's worse, but we don't need silly doomsday theories. And I think a lot of the games you see played with math can be used to contribute to some of those silly doomsday theories.
Yeah. Here's an interesting thought. First of all, you mentioned that you're going to try to do some follow-up studies. What were some of the ideas that you'll be following up? If you go to the next – go ahead real quick.
Yeah, so myself and 2 guys, Pete Steinmetz and Morgan Frank, who are both in the healthcare field, are working on a paper right now that really should be out by the end of this week if I get my kind of policy portion done in time. I think I will. But, I mean, that's going to go to some of the major medical journals. And essentially what we're looking at is there a correlation between shutdowns versus lockdown and a couple of different measures of success? So I'm going to do my simple but good model, which is first cases, then deaths. Then we're going to do we actually are going to do an R0 model. Is there a correlation between across all of the shutdown versus all the lockdown states? Is there a statistically significant correlation between locking down versus just well-done social distancing and R0 across all of the weeks? And it really doesn't look like there is, certainly not at the level of substantial statistical significance. Then we're going to look at some other things. Like one of the things we do find is that there's a correlation between mobility and decreased COVID-19 infections. But the mobility decrease has been pretty much the same in shutdown and in social distancing and lockdown states. However, in social distancing states, people are still able to do business when they want to, pick up things from their favorite restaurant curbside, get a haircut. So their mobility isn't necessarily just walking around in the park, and you've seen very little economic decline. Whereas in lockdown states, you've seen a much more substantial economic decline. So that, to me, is an argument for social distancing. You let people make their own decisions and don't destroy the economy. But that paper should be out within a couple of weeks. There's another paper I'm working on with a guy named Christos Makritis, who used to work in the White House, But there we're looking at the effect of a whole bunch, and this is more a conventional social science paper, but we're looking at the effect of a whole bunch of things, including temperature, testing rate, style of government, so on COVID-19 infections and deaths across really all the countries in the world. And all this information is available right there on Worldometer's coronavirus. It's available on covidtesting.com, so on down the line. So I do have a couple papers on this coming out.
Yeah, let me throw this out to you. Because here's what I play, like I say, I'm in the political business. So I'm always doing polling and stats and all this stuff every day. And I look at this every day. And one of the things, I did for the last couple of weeks, Foundation, every week they'll do an update on unemployment claims.
Okay.
By states. And then, so what I did, I said, okay, I wonder what would happen if you look at states with unemployment claims, those at the lower end, where you mentioned may have better economic data, and then compare that, because I hate to use compare that to deaths per million. How would they correlate? And like last week, I kind of noticed, well, over a period like May 9th to May 9th to May 16th, what I stated is that those states, they had the lowest, unemployment, pretty much the lowest unemployment claims. Also, most of them also had the lowest deaths per million. And
that's fascinating.
Now, yeah, and the other interesting thing is I looked at Republican versus Democrat states. Even though there are two Republican states, Massachusetts and Maryland, that pretty much will be part of the lockdown, most of them pretty much went to social distancing. And what I found was, on the average, you had increase of 9 deaths per million on the Republican states for an increase of about 9 or 10%. And you had 22 deaths per million for an increase among the Democratic states for an increase of 9 or 10%. And I was thinking, and I wasn't necessarily going lockdown, but I was, on the average, I was thinking, well, most Republicans are going in that direction, states. But because the biggest claim is going to be, hey, we're going to have massive deaths when we start opening up the economy. And so far, this will tell me that's not happening. That was my thought.
That's actually really interesting in terms of the second variable, political party in the state. To really get significance out of that coming from a social science perspective, you'd have to put that in what's called a linear or log linear regression model, where you'd have to control for other things. Because, I assume the Democratic blue states are also going to be, the more heavily populated states, probably the higher crime states. You're going to have a younger population, more minority population. But that's really interesting. And that actually, I might put the first one of those in my paper, actually, just from the perspective of trade-offs. We have to look at, so if you want to look at deaths, you might argue that there's a slight advantage for lockdowns, even though we don't find that. But this is the effect of lockdowns on unemployment versus social distancing. That's an interesting graph.
Yeah, so, it was one of the things, because I was looking at it, I was thinking to myself, but okay, because you're absolutely right, state to state, but okay, like Florida and Texas, you can compare to Michigan, where you had a lockdown, New York, you had a lockdown. The only state that I could sit back and see that had a lockdown, but also has a low death per million, was California. California would be, that was the one state that would be the complete opposite of the other blue states. It was in the bottom half of deaths per million.
Well, that also depends on your definition of lockdown versus shutdown. So there were only 9 states that didn't put an SIP order in place. Now, off the air, we can joke about how many people obeyed that in some of these Republican states like Texas. But, for example, Florida did lock down pretty effectively. Florida closed their beaches. And DeSantis, he knew this was going to make him unpopular for a while, but he did a pretty good job with it, if that's the term, with cops clearing the beaches and so on. So the 9 states that didn't lock down, if I recall correctly, were Oklahoma, Arkansas, Nebraska, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, couple others. I may have said Nebraska already.
Yeah.
But there was a set pool of them that didn't, and like I said, a lot of them were pretty good-sized states. You've got some major league teams in some of those states, but most states did lock down, blue or red, across the lines. I mean, I know Bullock, a conservative Democrat up there in Montana, was one of the first to lock down. Hawaii locked down, sealed the borders for a while. But again, I don't think that made a difference. And that's one of the things that we saw in terms of the argument that you probably saw some panic there. Like in Bullock's Montana, for a long time, the number of deaths was 14. And that's a big state. I mean, they didn't really have necessarily a reason to do that. I think everyone basically read Ferguson and was afraid of that idea of 2 million dead people, perhaps 100,000 in their state. And then, I mean, we saw what happened with that. I mean, Ferguson, we don't need to discuss his personal life, the mistress and him being fired and so on. But, I mean, the model's now under attack, and I think people are reevaluating the decisions they made based on it.
Yeah. Hold on, this is Tom Donelson with the Donelson Files. CoCo Konski is on vacation. We have Wilfred Reilly. We'll be right back on the Donelson Files on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
Since Buffalo Wild Wings is always open late, here are a few things you'll enjoy. Buzzer beaters, wings in 21 signature sauces and seasonings, and great deals on food and beer. Grab select domestic draft beer starting at $4. $4 shareables like street tacos, fried pickles, chili queso dip, mozzarella sticks, and roasted garlic mushrooms, and deals on select liquor and house cocktails. Phew, that's a mouthful. Catch all of the late night action. Buffalo Wild Wings. Wings, beer, sports. Offers and participation vary. Please drink responsibly. Void where prohibited.
Yes, Buffalo Wild Wings, and don't forget every Thursday night is boneless chicken wing night, where you can get a free order for every order you place. So if you place an order for 10, guess what? You'll get 10 free. Buffalo Wild Wings, and when things start opening up, it is the place to go if you want to go see about any sporting event that you can think of. This is Tom Donelson on the Donelson Files with our special guest Wilfred Reilly on the Batchelor News Radio Network. All right, let's go back to the models, because here's the other aspect that irritates me to no end. And it's just, there have been so many failures of models. And yet when we have data that's coming in that contradicts this, still holding on to some of these models.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the question, you first of all, as a researcher, what extent do you depend on models, and what extent do you say there's a limitation?
Well, I don't actually model at all. I mean, to some extent, that's just because it's not where my statistical training went. I do linear, logistic, occasional time series regressions. If you want to get wonky, I also do some basic cross tabulations. But I mean, a part of that is that I also think that modeling is, to a certain extent, if you're talking about game theory or whatever, just making up BS. There's a great computer science term called GIGO, which means garbage in, garbage out. And what that means in the human sciences, where we don't know the inputs like the computer science or the engineering or even the military guys do, is that when you predict something like a disease cycle or a climate change cycle in terms of the effects on an actual society, you're just guessing. So if you look at Ferguson's model, you really see that. I mean, so he estimates the IFR is 1%. We now know it's 0.3%. He estimates the infection rate is 80%. Let's say we now know it's 40%. He estimates people won't social distance. We now know they will, to the extent that it's as effective as locking down, plus or minus 5%. So you can just see from those parameters that I gave you that have changed, that we now know are accurate, that the original projections of the model are worthless. So that's a good one-sentence summary of why modeling is worthless. Not modeling is worthless, but why many expert prediction models seem to always be wrong. And I will say, I'll admit my own bias up front. I'm center-right. I'm a businessman. I like to actually see where the stock ticker was yesterday. I don't like projection models, hate them. But this isn't just my personal opinion. There's a long damn history of these prophets being wrong. This is true on the left. It's true on the hard right. It goes back 50 years. I'm going to give some examples. Probably the most famous example of this is Paul Ehrlich. Do you remember the book, The Population Bomb?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm old enough to, I was old enough to when the book came out. So, I mean, I'm in my mid-60s, so yes. I spent
Well, this is here. You might correct me on this, but this is like the 5th, 6th best-selling book all time after the Bible and Quran.
Yeah.
This is a book. This is one of the early projection models. And I'm having fun, but this book influenced governments. This book got people killed. This is a book based on a simple extrapolation model just before the Green Revolution and before birth control was invented, by the way, in 1966. They take the average of 2.7 children that was then the case in Eastern Europe and I think the developed parts of Africa, and they say if you extend that 2.7 over an average 16-year generation and you multiply by whatever, the world will run out of food, and I think it was 2036. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Now, that is correct. A much smarter guy named Malthus had made this same calculation several hundred years ago. The problems with this model are, one, in the Western world, and for that matter in developed Africa, people no longer have 3 children per couple, 1. We developed birth control, 2. We developed better means of agriculture, thanks to the USA and to some extent the Germans, 3. And just on and on and on and on. It turned out to be complete BS. Nobody starved to death. We have 8 billion people in the world now, and people are happier than ever before. In fact, it's a major problem in the Western world for us to have enough kids to keep our society going, following the rise of third-wave feminism and so on. So this is probably the most dramatically wrong model of this kind. But this just went on and on throughout the 70s and 80s. I mean, if you remember, quote-unquote, peak oil, we were going to run out of resources because the model showed we were consuming so much oil and we only had so much oil. Turns out world's a big place, and we got spacecraft that can go to Mars now. We found a lot more oil. The heterosexual AIDS epidemic.
Let me follow that up, because I can tell you this.
Of course.
I can always remember, you go back every 20 years on oil as a good example of what you're talking about, is they'll say, look at, let's say, the prediction of here's how much oil we're going to have in 1990 and 1970. You go to 1990 data, we exceeded their prediction. 1990 to 2000. It's almost consistent. I mean, you could literally go to every prediction, go 20 years down the road and find out they were the mark on the low side. And
that
it's even more today with the fracking revolution. I mean, it's like somebody, one of the things I would say, if you would have sat back and told anybody in the late 80s, by 2020 we would be a potential exporter, and the amount would be double and triple what's predicted, they would look at you and say, no way in hell. But that's exactly what happened. If you would have, and then Paul Ehrlich to me is one of those interesting, because the guy was so far off base. But here's the thing that I tell people, when people say, when you look at models, you look at prediction, I said, the number one resource that any society has is to allow human ingenuity to run free. The human mind is the most important resource. If you allow it to run free and be liberalized, you're going to get results that you won't even anticipate. If you control it, including all the shortages and the starvation, and everything.
Yeah, no, I'm a capitalist business guy, and I would agree. That's well put. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
and that's what, to me, I look at this and I say to myself, this is the thing that nobody takes into account. It's just like when I look at, again, I tend to be more of a climate change skeptic, because I look at these models and I'm thinking, how can you predict every aspect of climate? We don't fully understand it. And you're going to tell me what's going to be like 50 years down the road? When we got models on this pandemic, we can't even predict a week.
Yeah, the issue with that is that, so in a sentence, models are really bad at predicting exponential change. So, it is kind of funny to think that if we have trouble predicting where COVID-19 is going to be or HIV is going to be in a month, we can predict where the effects of the sun are going to be in 50 years. Yeah, that does seem really, really questionable. But this is true for almost all of this stuff. If you look at the big doomsday predictions, acid rain was one of these. That was another example of modeling based on the percentage of, corrosive chemicals that were going up into the cloud layers. The ozone hole based on our use of chlorofluorocarbons. I remember my high school girlfriend hated this in terms of the change in hairspray, but we just stopped using 1% of the chemicals in certain brands of hairspray. killer bees in the great northerly migration. We grew slightly different crops. Now we're worried there won't be any bees, although now we say the hornets are going to kill us all. So there have been over and over and over again these predictions that simply ignored some kind of obvious exponential change and thus were wrong. And it's very worth keeping that in mind with climate change. Like a question I would ask your listeners, your viewers to keep in mind is who's going to be the Neil Ferguson of climate change? It might be my favorite Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, actually, or Greta Thunberg. We might already have some contenders. But who's going to be the person that comes forward and says everyone has to give up their vehicle or 150 million people are going to die? And are people just going to do that like they did with COVID? I mean, every normal tax-paying citizen stayed inside for 2 months because of what turned out to be this BS. Are we going to do this again when it comes to the climate, or when people abandoned the sexual revolution because the heterosexual AIDS epidemic didn't occur? How often will this occur?
Hold on to that thought. This is Tom Donelson with the Donelson Files on the Batchelor News Radio Network. Special guest, Wilfred Reilly.
You might know me. I'm 50 Cent. You may follow my tweets, my Facebook friends. Odds are fewer than 6 degrees separate us. We're that close. What's crazy is 1 in 6 don't know where their next meal is coming from. These are your co-workers, your neighbors, your friends. Hunger's too close for us to ignore. So visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank to see how you can make a difference. From one close friend to another, let's do this. I'm 50 Cent, and together we are Feeding America.
A message from Feeding America and the Ad Council.
And don't forget the Dr. Larry Show with Dr. Larry Fedewa takes a look at politics from a conservative perspective of the Trump era. Listen to him every Wednesday, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Block Talk Radio. The podcast of his shows every Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and on thebatchelornews.airtime.pro. If you're interested in having your own show or advertising, email us at labachelor40@gmail.com. Listen and stay informed. Okay, we're going to kind of move to a little bit different direction. Is I am reading your book, Taboo, which I love.
Okay.
The stats are incredulous, and there's a few chapters here that caught me, and I'm going to try to get to some kind of a summary, what you're saying. But the first one I want to, you've debated Jared Taylor, the alt-right white nationalist, which I think is just a nice way of saying racist.
Mm-hmm.
Call somebody a white nationalist. It's just a euphemism. But you have a chapter. Alt-right has nothing to offer. Give us a summary of that chapter.
Sure. Yeah, I think that was an important chapter to write because, I mean, I'm a black man. I think most of your listeners are aware of that, although I don't talk about it all the time. I think most people can figure it out when they see me. But I'm not especially woke. I lean right. And if you're present, so a bit of a ramble here. Anyway, if you're active in internet culture, one of the things you see is that there are a number of figures. The Red Ice team, Stefan Molyneux, Jared Taylor when he was active online, you could argue Milo Yiannopoulos, that argue positions that are quote-unquote alt-right or alt-right adjacent. And, for example, that there are differences in performance between racial groups because of genetic ability, not because of culture, which is what I think, or because of past racial oppression, which is what the left would argue, that have a lot of influence among young working-class white men. I think a lot of young white guys who aren't rich feel with some justification, that everyone else seems to constantly talk about their identity and they are not supposed to. And a lot of people refuse to kind of take on the alt-right. It's become a bit taboo to do so. This whole book is about taboo topics, things you're not supposed to talk about. Is there any reality there? So very often when someone like Jared Taylor, who's a pleasant and engaging guy, although he's a racist, in a $1,000 suit, steps forward and says, I have some real questions about feminism, or I have some real questions about black performance. And the response is, a shrieking, purple-haired college kid. A lot of ordinary white dudes who haven't had an exceptionally easy life are going to say maybe there's something to what this guy's saying. So what I do in that chapter is point out that a lot of alt-right ideas aren't bad because they're racist, quote-unquote. They're bad because they're stupid. So I look at the idea. Yeah, I look at that and just.
I'm going to put it this way because you make a point. I wrote my last book, Rise of National Populism in Democratic Social. I deal with this issue because I had several exchanges with these individuals. I mean, I even had one guy, and I quote this in my book, who defended fascism. And I said, I kind of wrote back, do you really, are you really a fascist? And his answer was, absolutely, it's a great system. He defended it. I'm like, okay. This was good for my books. But here was the thing that struck me the most. And I don't know if you saw this with Jared Taylor, is when you start looking at what these people stand for, and I'll give you 3 examples. Their position on healthcare is not much different than Alexander Cortez, single payer. Their position on the environment is not much different than a lot of green, than the Green New Deal. There were several articles, and I would ask some of these people, gave me a government or an economic system we should model ourselves after.
Norway or Germany.
No, China.
Oh.
It was China. I mean, they literally said, China is the government that we want. It's the economic system we want. It's so much better than what we have. And I'm like, okay, you guys are not even free marketeers. You're not even conservatives. You're a bunch of fascists to go along with your racist.
Yeah, so
ideology.
That's an important point. The alt-right is not conservatism on steroids. It's the extreme social justice movement for broke white guys. I mean, if you talk to these guys like Richard Spencer, what they want is not a free market Daniel Boone society, which I might have some problems with but think I'd do pretty well in. What they want is quote-unquote gives me dats for white guys. They just don't want the welfare system to extend to the black and Hispanic guys they now feel they have to compete with in their neighborhoods. And a lot of these ideas, I mean, briefly but sincerely, are extremely un-American. I mean, the idea of ethno-states, for example, first of all, diverse societies have been successful since ancient Rome. The idea that they don't work as often as monoracial gems like Somalia and Bosnia is just not true. But, I mean, in the USA, where we live close to one another, the idea of breaking up the country so that, for example, blacks get the South and whites get the Pacific Northwest would require about 70% of the population to put down their arms and move. That's just not going to happen. Require the breakup of about 85% of religious congregations. So, I mean, I talk about this. I also don't see the focus on IQ as being all that logical. I mean, right now there are some small tested differences in IQ. When Dickens and Flynn looked at this in 2006, the average black IQ, I believe, was 93. Whites were 99. The alt-right tends to give fake numbers on both of those ends. But the issue with this is that, as the great Tom Sowell has pointed out, IQs change dramatically as people improve and develop their culture. So, I mean, when this was tested at the time of World War I, the average IQ for Irishmen was 75. I mean, that's half of my family background. Right now it's 102. There's no genetic way that could have happened. I mean, the things that define who a man is or who a person is aren't their genes. It's who their father is, what their training is, religious background, business background, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because I remember reviewing. I had a chance to review Charles Murray, the Bell Curve, which again, there's a lot of misinterpretation of what he actually stated. But I made the point. I said, the problem I found with the Bell Curve was you were looking at decades. Tom Sowell has done a lot of his research. He was looking at centuries.
Yep.
I mean, he's written quite a bit of, worldwide differences in races, around the world. And I made the point. I said, one guy's writing centuries, the other guy's maybe writing decades. And I said, I think I'll take the guy who's writing in centuries, who's giving us a century worth of perspective. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. We're, like I said, I would love to have you show because there's a lot of other subjects you take on in Taboo. And I appreciate you being on the show. So real quickly before we end, where can people get a copy of this book?
Virtually anywhere. I mean, Taboo's not far from the bestseller lists. I mean, Amazon is, in general, the quickest, easiest spot right now with half the bookstores shut down. I mean, it's Wilfred Reilly, Wilfred Reilly. The book is Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. You can also find me by that same name on the Facebooks and the Twitters. Obviously, if your local bookseller is open, I encourage you to patronize them. But that book's very easy to find. Also, check out A Hate Crime Hoax and find out the reality behind the Jussie Smollett, Yasmin Saweetie, Covington Catholic, and virtually every other high-profile recent interracial hate story. But those are the two most recent books I wrote, both with Regnery, a large right-leaning powerhouse publisher. And I'd love to come back on the show and discuss either.
I'd love to have you back on because there's so much you put into that book that are worth examining, and I think it's worth it. So I'd love to have you back, and thank you very much for taking your time, sir. That was Wilfred Reilly, professor at Kentucky State University, studying his lockdown versus states who didn't use lockdown. This is Tom Donelson and the Donelson Files saying good night on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
Good night to you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
When you hear that trumpet, you know it's the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network. This is Dr. Larry Fedewa, and I'm your host for the next hour. Tonight we're going to start off with President Trump's leadership, which I think we need to look past the words at his actions. As the saying around Washington goes, President Donald J. Trump frequently steps on his own message, and nowhere is that observation more accurate than in the matter of his leadership during the current crisis. His verbal descriptions of the steps he has taken and the reasons for each step sound a lot like bragging, even at times a plea for praise. And in few cases do they clearly and accurately convey either the obstacles or the strategy which led to those decisions, both of which have been significant. So let's do a brief recap. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown the country into the worst crisis since Pearl Harbor. The President started our national response virtually alone. As the crisis began to take shape, he enlisted the aid of the public health experts, the national laboratories, the privately owned laboratories, then the hospitals, the manufacturing industries, and so on, as new requirements arose one after the other. When called upon, these Americans put aside their personal feelings and opinions about politics and proceeded to perform nearly miraculous feats, as when the Army Corps of Engineers created a hospital in Central Park in 3 days. What inspired this sensational cooperation? Basically, it was Trump's mixture of salesmanship and pressure. But the appeals of the President to the patriotism of these participants would not have been sufficient to effect the desired outcomes had he not presented each group with specific, well-thought-out tasks which fit the capabilities of each party. This is called detailed planning. The result was that each party was asked to do something they knew how to do and were capable of doing. In problem after problem, from medical supplies to hospital beds to pharmaceuticals to supply chains to manufacturing, the results were astonishing. Then the President organized the governors of the 50 states and the territories into the most important role they have ever played as a group, perhaps in American history. Even the bitterest critics of the President joined the coalition and developed a working relationship with the federal administration and with the President and Vice President, himself, by the way, a former governor. We witnessed the greatest example of federalism in the history of the Republic. James Madison would have been proud to see it in action. And there were also side effects of this strategy. First of all, it was the most practical solution to the extremely complex problems of a national recovery which featured thousands of varying circumstances and conditions. Clearly, the Democrats called for a national one-fits-all policy would never have worked. But that observation reveals another side effect. By sticking to the Constitution, the president's approach also made those criticisms of the opposition so obviously misguided that even the friendly press disregarded them. In all, we saw the most impressive example of presidential leadership, perhaps, since Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. The press, of course, missed this entire amazing spectacle which was unfolding before their very eyes. And for the most part, those eyes are blinded by the same unthinking bias which caused them to join the Dems' insane attempt to overthrow the presidency earlier this year. I have commented in the past that other speakers, such as Vice President Pence, frequently describe the president's actions more clearly and convincingly than does the president himself. However, the forum does make a difference. The president is very effective during his famous rallies in describing the mountains he has climbed as president and the results he has achieved. In fact, his ability to attract and entertain thousands of people in his rallies is unparalleled in modern politics. In this realm, only entertainers can compete. This ability is so unique that any discussion of Donald J. Trump's communication skills must begin with his rallies. Next would be his set speeches, which have improved with practice and since he learned to use the teleprompter. Finally would be his impromptu press briefings on his way to the airport. But his formal press conferences, not so much. In the end, of course, as the Bible says, by his works you shall know him. So I'd like to welcome back George Landreth, who is our guest again tonight, and we get a chance to finish the conversation we started last week. And welcome, George, back to the Dr. Larry Show. So we have a little technical glitch, it sounds again like tonight, and we'll be talking to George as soon as we can get him cleared and get the audio going again. I think that one of the major issues that comes about in the critique of the president's manner of speaking is really based upon his sort of a brash New York bravado, which is taken in various ways by the elite in Washington and elsewhere. It's much more like the kind of talk that you would get in a construction site than perhaps in the typical speech of politicians, particularly in the informal speech. However, I think that there have been some changes in the president as he has learned his job and learned his new role in the national life. One of them is the change in his disdain for politicians. If you recall, in the early days of his presidential campaign, one of the major criticisms he had was that the world has been talked about had been shaped by a lot of incompetent career politicians who were not very tuned to the people's requirements or desires, and in that respect, he was an outsider, and he was very proud of it. And in many respects, that's still a factor, but he has certainly learned that there are very important politicians too, and particularly as he has grown into his role as the head of the Republican Party. He's discovered that he really takes, it really requires that he take count of the value of these various politicians. You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
It's the two megastars summer mashup, the awesome iPhone, on the Rockstar Metro PCS Network. Get the iPhone you've always wanted for $0, so you can jam without limit.
It's a hit. Get an iPhone SE on us when you switch. Metro PCS. Coverage not available in some areas, plus sales tax and $10 activation fee. Requires port-in of number not currently active on T-Mobile network or on Metro PCS in past 90 days to an unlimited LTE plan. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Blog Talk Radio.
I'm not going very far.
It's too uncomfortable.
I'm in a hurry. Sometimes I just forget.
There's no such thing as a good excuse for not buckling up. You're not only putting yourself at risk of injury or death, it could also cost you lots of money. Cops are writing tickets, so why take the risk? Do the smart thing and start buckling up every trip, day or night. Click it or ticket. Paid for by NHTSA.
Welcome back to the Dr. Larry Show, home of the Batchelor News Radio Show also. If you want real discussions on politics, social issues, racial issues, and other topics, then tune in to the Batchelor News Radio Show. Listen live every Monday and Thursday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time at blogtalkradio.com. And if you miss a show, you can listen every Monday through Saturday at 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and every Sunday at 5 a.m. and 3 p.m. at thebatchelornews.airtime.pro. If you're interested in having your own show or advertising, email us at labachelor40@gmail.com. Listen and stay informed. And you're back with the Dr. Larry Show. And George is, I presume, is waiting to get on the program, and we will try to bring him to you as soon as possible. So we were talking about some of the ways in which the president has grown into the job of president of the United States, and another factor or another observation is that it seems like he is, I guess you would have to say, cleaned up his act. he's become much more obviously religious and much more concerned with the use and the appreciation of his own family and other families. And we've also seen that he is very interested in other people as they appear on his very, very large screen. And I think that's one of the things he really enjoys about being a president, that he gets to see and talk to so many different people. So I understand, George, you're with us this time? And so I guess he's not. At any rate, that's one thing that's been changed. That's the second thing, I guess you'd say. And the third thing is that we have we're having some difficulties.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now you can. Yes.
Okay.
We've been waiting for you.
I could hear, but for some reason my voice wasn't carrying far enough. Maybe I should open the window and yell outside. That might help. I don't know. But
Well, We're,
my kids have
we're
always
glad
told
you
me
finally
my voice
got back.
very well.
So I'm sure you have some comments about what we've been talking about so far.
Well, I do. You made a number of very good points. One of the things that there are certain areas of Donald Trump's communication that are skillful and well done and so forth. And there's other times where you kind of say to yourself, wait a minute, I think he's stepping on his own message. And I'm not critiquing him and saying that he should say what I want him to say. I'm saying that even if you look at what he wants to accomplish, sometimes he will kind of step on his own message. And so as a result, it's easy for detractors then to, poke fun at that or, make a lot of hay of that. But I think you make the very good point. If you were to look at how he has governed, it's actually been surprisingly successful. If you look at the economy, how well it did until COVID came along, and then you watch what he's done with COVID. I know there's a big narrative now to try to say that he's to blame for problems, but he's not the one who sent elderly sick people with COVID back to the elder care places. That was actually the governor of New York, and the press doesn't seem to want to hold him accountable for that. The press just kind of lets that go. If they had half that much, even a tenth that much kind of forgiving spirit with respect to how Donald Trump talks, they'd probably love him. But instead, it's. But I think it's kind of amazing. There was talk just a matter of a few weeks ago that we wouldn't have enough ventilators. We now have so many that we're able to send them to other countries that are struggling. So I think the president did an amazing thing, which was get America mobilized to fight this virus. And, on day one, as you said, he did it alone initially. He was called racist for shutting down travel with China. He was a xenophobe. He was a bad man. And now people want to change the narrative and say he didn't act soon enough. And I just kind of scratch my head and go, I'm sorry, but I don't think you can have it both ways. But anyhow, that's how they play the game.
Yeah, that has struck me also. I think that they seem to think that stopping the travel from China in the late January was not early enough for some people, when in fact those same people were actually criticizing him at that time for taking it too seriously and trying to scare people. But all of that all being said, the next issue I think is that he really is a matter. He's a man of action and not of words so much, even though he's very talkative. But
yeah, that's true. No, I agree. If you judge him on what he does, I think he has to get fairly high marks, which is, I think, why people who don't like him like to focus on what he says, because there's more to quibble with.
A lot of them don't really, I don't think, really understand what he's done, and that I think is one of the real conundrums of this whole puzzle, because what he's done is basically organizational. I think as a organizer, he has turned out to be a really strong person. He's become anybody that could organize all of those governors, many of whom are not Republican. In fact, several of whom have been explicitly anti-Trump right from the beginning, and yet he organized all of those people, and they came together. They cooperated. They really did some wonderful things in with his encouragement, and they followed his leadership. To me, that is a really amazing type of accomplishment, and he gets no credit for that I have been able to find. the other factor is that he has become. We knew he was a good negotiator because of his background and his writings about it. But anybody that could bring China to the table and make China agree to the kinds of concessions that have characterized so far the Chinese interest in trade, in spite of the and then on top of that, you go ahead and impose tariffs on them. I mean, I think that's almost unbelievable. And this is I think going to become a really major part of his legacy, that he is the one that really engaged the Chinese people and particularly the Chinese party, the Chinese government, into a real rivalry for the leadership of the world, and in the effect, he actually defended and enhanced the place of the United States in that whole picture.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. One of the things that I think is, at least in hindsight, it's not surprising he's good at organizing, because if you think about it, he's been a builder, and that doesn't mean he lays the bricks or he runs the pipe or installs the windows or things himself, but he has to organize big projects, and he has to get a lot of different moving parts together to build whatever it is that he's working on. And there's a story, of course, of I think it was the ice rink in Central Park somewhere in New York that the government had been working on for years to get open and ready. And finally he just said, "Here, I'll do it." And he managed the project. He didn't get paid for it personally, but just did it, and did it inexpensively and got it done in record time. Again, I think it's because that's what he does. He understands how to work with people and get all the moving parts done in a way that accomplishes the task. And I would argue, when you look at the doomsday, we didn't have enough PP&E because when we had the last pandemic, the government used them all up and then didn't replace them, even though they were told they should. That was the Obama administration. The press won't talk about that, though, because after all, he's near deity, so they don't want to be committing blasphemy. But we didn't have enough ventilators, all these other things, and all of a sudden now we have them. And all of a sudden now we're doing testing at record pace, and we're in a position to help other countries, when only a matter of weeks ago we were wringing our hands saying, how will we get past this? We're just so unprepared and we can't do it. So I think that's a matter of organization, and you have to give him credit, even though the Rachel Maddows of the world will not do that. It wouldn't matter if he like the old, I think it was President Johnson, who said, if I walked across the Potomac River, the headline the next day would be, Johnson can't swim. Right. I think there's some truth to that in this case. It's just kind of, and I don't think it serves the national interest. We want a rigorous watchdog that holds politicians accountable. But we don't see that now. Basically, it's getting to the point now where if you are a, liberal, then most of the mainstream press will simply not hold you accountable. They refuse to. Everything you do is awesome and great. We see that even right now with Joe Biden. Imagine, another candidate from a different party basically appearing occasionally in his basement and half the time not making any sense. Wouldn't they make fun of that and have a heyday with that? But not in his case. Or we can also compare and contrast the sexual harassment claims. It seems to me we need a press that's going to be serious about holding elected officials, irrespective of their party or ideology, accountable. And they ought to, sunlight's a great disinfectant. So the value of a free press is very important, but I feel like most of our press today lets the public down because they don't actually do that. They are cheerleaders, not watchdogs. And they'll only watchdog one side, but they won't watchdog the other side. The other side, they will cheer them. They'll lead the cheers, and it's cheerleading is fun if you're at a football game and it's homecoming and all that, but it doesn't really do much for democracy. So it's unfortunate, and I feel like you've hit several really salient points here. Even the China deal, the trade deal. I have to be honest, I thought it was going to take much longer, and I wasn't sure he would get near the results that he got. It just struck me that, they would wait him out. With an election coming up, I thought for sure they would wait him out to see if he would win or not. And no, but he ended up getting some real progress there, and I was, like I said, surprised by that.
Well, hold that thought, and we're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
This is Chicago-style hot dog here. I'm not feeling too good. Turns out, along with all the other bad things my cholesterol does, they say it's a risk factor for strokes. Strokes? Sheesh. Good news from National Stroke Association. Exercising, eating right, and asking your doctor about medicines that can help lower your cholesterol like statins may reduce the risk of a first stroke. And if you've already had a stroke, it's even more important you lower your cholesterol.
Lower your chances of stroke by controlling your cholesterol. Visit stroke.org today.
Taste and health. You want both in one cranberry juice? You want Northland.
Northland has a kick to it. I like that. It says 100% juice on their label. That tells me it's healthy.
Cranberry raspberry, cranberry grape. I love all their flavors.
Northland. A great taste and the health benefits of cranberry. Only Northland has 27% cranberry in all 9 of its 100% juice cranberry blends.
I choose Northland because it fits my healthy lifestyle.
Northland. 100% juice, 100% refreshing.
Welcome back to the Dr. Larry Show. It's the home of another good show, the You and the Law show with Chief Keith Humphrey and Chief Virgil Green. You and the Law is a show which has open and honest conversations about law enforcement and their relationship with the black and brown communities. Listen live every Tuesday night from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time at blogtalkradio.com, and the podcast every Monday through Friday at 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. Eastern Time on the Batchelor News, thebatchelornews.airtime.pro. And if you're interested in having your own show or advertising with us, email us at labachelor4040@gmail.com. Listen and stay informed. So we're talking with George Landreth, and we've been talking. We've been, for the most part, very complimentary to the current president, and I think there are really some areas that we probably are not too excited about, and I think it's only fair that we address some of those as well. And I guess I would start off with the idea that I think that there's a little bit of defensiveness, which is perfectly understandable, frankly, but which has grown up in the rhetoric of the president, and which is, I think, doing him quite not doing him a lot of favors. But George, you probably have some ideas along those lines yourself.
Yeah, I do. I think, for example, and I don't remember the date of it. It was, more than a year ago, but it was the first time, as I recall, that we had record low black unemployment, record low Hispanic unemployment, and record low woman unemployment. So good news on all fronts. More women, more blacks, more Hispanics employed than ever before type thing. And that was going to be the news story for the weekend. And sure, if you were a left-winger, you could say, well, this is actually Barack Obama's economy or something like that. But the reality is, I don't know that there's a lot of people who honestly believe that, almost 4 years later, when we had anemic growth and all that, that all of a sudden things perked up literally the day after Trump was elected, and that's Barack Obama's doing. But having said that, it was going to be a good weekend for him. And then, within an hour or two, he had tweeted something about, that woman I forget her name now. She was the adult entertainer and he referred to her as Horseface. And so now the narrative switched. And so instead of talking about the things that he had accomplished, we were going to talk about whether or not he should call this woman that and all the underlying facts and all this. And so at times I scratch my head and say, let's focus on the things that actually help you do the stuff that's helping America. Because I don't think there's any question he's done a lot of things to help America, but occasionally he diverts our attention from it by some of the things he decides to talk about, like you were describing. And so that does frustrate me sometimes, not because I dislike the man. I'm actually rooting for any president to help America be great. That's true whether it's Barack Obama or whether it's Donald Trump. This is a country I love. The Americans are people I love. I want them to be prosperous. I want them to be free. And so it's hard to root against the president. You might root against a bill or a proposal that you think is wrong-headed, but you don't generally just root that the president fails, because then you're rooting for America on some level to have troubles. But and so I just wish sometimes he had a little. We all have thoughts that are best kept private, and I sometimes feel like he's almost too transparent. I never thought I'd be complaining about government being too transparent, but I don't know that we need to think or know every thought that goes through his head.
Yeah, I think also that there's an element of name calling and trash, what we call in sports trash talk, that it really doesn't help his cause, and in fact it just kind of emphasizes the fact that he seems to have a pretty thin skin, really, when it comes to criticism by other people. In fact, he makes a point of it. He says he's a counterpuncher, which means to him every time somebody takes a shot at him, then he has to come right back and talk to them by name and so on. And of course, the contrast might be with George Bush, who took it all and never mentioned his opponents, and was very gentlemanly about all of the bad trash talk that was made against him, and boy, some of it was really terrible. Yeah. But and maybe that was the far extreme, but it really is not helpful. It's really not helpful in a lot of cases.
No, agreed. I think it might be good a little bit maybe in the middle, so that sometimes people will say something and it might be a little snarky, but it's not even clearly directed at the president. It sounds like it probably was, but they didn't mention by name, and then he responds. And my attitude would be is I'm not responding unless you try to, A, make it very clear you're talking about me, and two, probably only respond to some of it because, it seems a little too nitpicky if every time. So I agree with you, but I also think that maybe George Bush's approach was a little too relaxed because, I didn't think that at the time, but I've kind of looked back on it and think to myself, when two people are debating, let's say you and I were having a debate, and one of us says something that's completely outrageous, and the other person just looks and says, well, I think I see it a little differently, but doesn't kind of say that was outrageous. Are you kidding me? Then the public who's watching the debate may not fully appreciate how outrageous the behavior is. So I think it's okay for the president to get frustrated with the press and to call them out for being for being biased. In fact, I don't even think they're biased anymore because bias is subtle. But, it's far worse than bias. But bottom line is, I don't think it can be kind of like almost all you do verbally. At some point, there needs to be a balance to it so that you don't wear it out almost. And I agree that there needs to be, well, you can even look at polling data. there are certain constituencies that you would think might be supportive of him but have a hard time doing it because it's the style over substance issue. They don't necessarily disagree with all the stuff he's doing, but they just can't bear all the stuff he's saying, and it bothers them.
Of course, I think he has a really the same type of problem that Reagan and the Bushes had, and even though it's maybe much more exaggerated in his case, but and that is that people don't really get to know what he's been doing unless they make a tremendous effort to find out, because the press being so biased, the basic job of the press is to let people know and understand what is going on in government and elsewhere, but particularly also in government, and there's just no way that they even give him a shot. It's so biased and so lopsided and so misinterpreted and misunderstood and misrepresented that he is constantly on the defensive, which is really a impediment to people understanding, the average American citizen understanding what the guy has really done. And I think I've mentioned in some of my columns that some of the atrocious names that he has called, for example, it's just incredibly unrealistic. I mean, there's just no basis whatsoever in some of these names that he's called, and yet where do these people believe that, and they swear by it, and to the extent of being against him. But and I really think that there's a mythological Donald Trump that is made up in the minds of the opposition, and in fact is not available to being even discussed as in any factual terms, because it's just so outlandish that there's just no accounting for it, and I think that this is a really a problem that is very, very difficult to deal with, because you can't go around telling people I'm not really as bad as they say I am. Yet so I guess what he really needs is he needs people that will be able to defend him and without and factually, and there's some of that coming about now too. I think a lot of the so-called rhinos were not only not defending him, they were kind of buying into some of the folklore, and I think we're starting to see, like McConnell, for example, is now definitely on his side, whereas Ryan wasn't, and I think the same thing is true of the House leadership.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what the House does, because there's talk that they want to hold a second set of potential impeachment hearings over his handling of the COVID. And I just think to myself, wow, these guys think that every time you disagree with someone, you can impeach them. Impeachment was, first of all, we have to understand, from a constitutional perspective, the president was designed to be an independent executive. And so it isn't possible that every time there's a dispute between the House and the presidency that they get to impeach him. The founders clearly did not intend that. A parliamentary system allows there to be a no confidence vote, which means you don't have to even prove the guy did anything. You can just say, we're tired of his leadership. We want to move on now. And they can do that. Our founders were aware of that system and rejected it. because they believed you needed checks and balances, so they wanted a strong and independent executive. And so they only included the impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors. All of a sudden now, apparently, if you, if Gerald Nadler doesn't agree with you, then that's a high crime and misdemeanor, in which case probably most Americans are guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors because Gerald Nadler he's a bit of a loon, quite frankly.
Well, you're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
If you're an African American man, you need to know about oral cancer. Oral cancer is more common in African American men than in any other group in the U.S. If you have a sore or lump in your mouth that doesn't go away after 2 weeks, see a doctor or a dentist. Most often these symptoms don't mean cancer, but it's important to get them checked. If you do have oral cancer, it can be treated more successfully if it's caught early. A message from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Hi, it's Jamie, Progressive's Employee of the Month, 2 months in a row. Leave a message at the... Hi, Jamie. It's me, Jamie. I just had a new idea for our song about the Name Your Price tool. So when it's like, tell us what you want to pay, hey, 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 and the trombone goes, blah, 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 and you say, we'll help you find coverage options to fit your budget. Then we just all do finger snaps while a choir goes, statements coming at ya, statements coming at ya. Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, see your practice tonight. I got new lyrics for the rap break.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network. And George, why don't you take a minute here and tell the folks a little bit more about what y'all are doing over there at the Frontiers for Freedom.
Sure. Well, Frontiers of Freedom is, you can find our website. It's ff.org, just 2 F's and .org, pretty simple. And we were founded by a U.S. Senator named Malcolm Wallop. He was a good friend and political ally of Ronald Reagan, so that probably gives you an idea kind of where we come from on the political spectrum, which, maybe to some people's liking and not to others, and I understand that. That's fine. That's part of what makes America great is there's no requirement we agree on everything. And we don't have to hate each other if we don't. But basically, our mission statement asks us to promote freedom and opportunity. It asks us to be dedicated as an organization to the principles of individual liberty, peace through strength, limited government, free enterprise, and the values and principles that you see embodied when you read the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And that way we feel like we're playing a positive role in a robust debate. We're trying to preserve, renew, and defend freedom and create a robust culture where freedom, opportunity, and prosperity are promoted through effective discussion, analysis, and advocacy. So that's the space that we play in, as it were.
Well, it's certainly a worthy cause, and I appreciate the fact that you're carrying my columns in your on your website as well, and that is ff.org. Isn't that correct?
Yep. That's correct. And one of the reasons I like to have your articles there, and I understand that, everyone has some people are, left of center, some are right of center and all that. And people can say, oh, I don't like that person because they don't agree with me. But I always feel like the stuff that you write is based in fact, is well-reasoned and thought out. It's not hyperbole. It's a serious attempt to deal with real issues, and I think that's what we need more of in America, quite frankly, is that sort of dispassionate caring about the country enough that we don't give in to tribalism, and this idea of and I mean, I consider you a friend. We've talked about issues. I know we agree on many, many things. But that's actually not the reason why I want your stuff on our website. It's because there's something inherently valuable about a serious conversation about important issues. And I think I hope that the people who listen are quite frankly, I hope they're not all just Me Tooers. They just, I listen because I agree with them. I hope there's people who listen because they say, he makes me think about things. And that's a useful endeavor.
We're all for it. We're all for it.
I know
that's
you
exactly
are.
what I try to do,
business?
and I appreciate your kind words. We've covered some ground here today, and I think we were talking last week about the whole issue of the China factor in that's coming very, very prominently into place now with the people that are in fact trying to push this idea of punishing the Chinese before we get through with all the trade and all of the other lines of positive interchange that goes on or should go on, and we're hoping goes on between ourselves and China as our rivals. And frankly, that is getting to be more and more popular, and I must say I am very, very much against it. I believe that we are taking a terrific chance if we get the if we offend the Chinese to the point where we start to encourage a kind of I guess I would say a kind of animus and even confrontation, which might in turn become military, before we get all of our problems with the Chinese resolved. In fact, it seemed like what we would normally do, or what we were on the track of doing, is trying to get China to become a much more responsible and much more even-handed international player, and all of that is just rapidly beginning to dissipate in front of our eyes. And I certainly hope that we do not have that kind of outcome of all of this talk.
You make a good point. When I listen to the president, I get the feeling that he understands what you're talking about, and what I mean by that is he's asked, been point blank, are you going to go after them? Are you going to cause retribution? And he always has kind of what I would call a nuanced answer, which actually is often not the way he is. I don't know that people would say he's terribly nuanced, but in this one he has been. And I think it's a reflection of what you're talking about, because instead of going for retribution, we ought to just try to pursue what's in our best interest. And that would, I think, be long-term trade deals that will be beneficial to, America. And I don't mean unfairly beneficial, because we used to have trade deals that unfairly benefited them. I just mean fair ones where we can profit, and we don't just hand over money and jobs to them. And the president was pursuing those and achieving those. So I would like to see those. I would like to see a lot of long-term progress made, as opposed to a short-term, I would feel good to punch you in the nose and watch your nose bleed, and then I'll feel good about myself. I feel like, why don't we focus on a long-term, they're going to be around for a long time, we're going to be around for a long time. Let's shape the relationship so that it is, so that we look at what's good for America. And sometimes we get too focused on satiating that anger that's built up in us. We just want to punch someone in the nose. I haven't heard him sound like that's what he's going for. And I'm encouraged by that, because I think he will take a tough stance. We saw him do that in the trade deals. I'm not saying he won't be tough, but I think your point is pursue America's interests. Don't just act kind of blindly, irrationally out of anger and a hope for retribution. They say if you're gonna go for revenge, you need to dig two graves, one for yourself, and if you're lucky, the one you're going after.
Well, and the other factor is that just in the normal pursuit of what the president started out to do, which is to even the playing field in terms of trade with China and the rest of the world, by the way. That's already punishing the Chinese significantly without, in fact, imposing the tariffs on them has been a real, that's been it's a bone crusher, and it's amazing that it's actually been accepted. You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network.
To promote my new flower shop, I had one place print my business cards, another print my brochures, and a third, my signs. Now my roses aren't red, my violets aren't blue, my geraniums look dead, and I don't know what to do.
Staples can help your business stand out with signs, banners, and brochures that are a true reflection of your company. And now at Staples, spend $50 or more on print and marketing services and get $5 off your next in-store purchase.
Now my business is blossoming, and I'm spending less green.
Exclusions apply. In-store only. End 6/23/18.
Blog Talk Radio.
You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network, and my program is on the radio live every Wednesday night at 7:00 at blogtalkradio.com, and also we are on the podcast at 11 actually 4 a.m. and 11 a.m. 5 days a week at www.bachelor. I got to get this right. My notes are failing me, but it's airtime. LABachelor.airtime.pro, and that's a pre-timed, and so it can only be listened to at the time, but 11 a.m. Monday through Friday. The other factor that I want to bring up tonight, and it's one that's increasingly difficult, is the Congress and the role of the Congress. It seems like once in a while they can get together and do something fruitful, but the standard idea of having a procedure where normally what's supposed to happen is that somebody, one of the senators or one of the congressmen introduces a program, or it might be more than one sponsor, and that is then submitted to the speaker, and if they think that it has merit, then they turn it over to the appropriate committee. The committee debates the subject and has hearings on it, and finally reports out whatever they decided, whether it be another version, an amended version of the original, or whether it just simply be defeated, and then it goes to the full body. We are not having that kind of constructive debate and amendment process in either house right now, and it's really means that people the House it's just amazing what's happened. Namely, they've got a handful of people that are developing. This last proposal was 1,800 pages. They developed by a handful of people, and then they call the Congress, the House, into session, and before they know it, they all have to vote on it without even having read it. And of course, this is by the speaker that famously said regarding Obamacare, you have to pass it before you can read it. This whole thing is just not very anti-democratic, and it's showing in the poor output, quality and quantity of what's coming out of the Congress. So I'm very upset with the abdication of due process and due procedure that's occurring. Some frankly is probably due to the pandemic, but generally speaking, it wasn't very good before that, and probably isn't going to be very good after that.
Yeah, sadly, that's true. Yeah, you can blame a lot of things on the pandemic, but the truth is, this Congress really was. They're not passing budgets the way they used to be done. It used to be that committees that oversaw certain parts of the government, whether it was the Pentagon or the Department of Justice, would hold hearings on their budget, and they do overview and review of oversight, and then they would mark up and they would do them be passed, and it would get to. There used to be a process where we cerebrally looked at things, and now we just do continuing resolutions in perpetuity because they can't do anything, they can't agree on anything. And I am trying to figure out, this began actually during the Obama years, and I'm trying to figure out, and it's gotten worse since, what happened to us that the people we send to Washington to represent us can't set aside their hostilities even for a few minutes to do something like pass budgets. And so we end up having the same budget we had 5 years ago. And issues might be different now. So why is that a good idea? And imagine if you and your wife couldn't agree, so you end up agreeing to the budgets you had the first year of your marriage, while you're still in college or something. It's a weird way to do business, but it's kind of where we're at. And I think it gets down to this tribalism of, I don't want to cooperate with you because it might help you in some way. And to me, it's like being in a boat and someone saying, we got to row to shore. The big ship sunk. We got on the lifeboat. We're rowing ashore. And someone who hates you starts shooting a hole in the bottom of the boat saying, I'm going to show you. And it's like, dude, can you stop doing that? We're all in the boat. And you think you're just getting me, but you're going to get us all. And I don't understand it. It's very kind of childish behavior, but we see it kind of play out on the national stage now for a while. And it makes me think that we're going to have to send some different people to Washington and tell them we expect something better of it. And when you unelect somebody, so to speak, and get their political scalp in that way, meaning that they're retired, sent home to get a different job, it might send a message. We're tired of this. Can you just do your job, please? I have to do my job at work.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I think that this whole subject may actually turn out to be a different focus entirely after November 3rd, because it looks like there's going to be a real battle for the control of the Senate, and the House is already a big battle. If the Democrats win both sides, both houses, even if the president does win the re-election for president, we're going to have one hell of a Donnybrook for 4 years. It's really going to be a mess. But
yeah, they'll probably impeach Trump once a week.
What's that?
I said they'd probably impeach Trump once a week.
Yeah, every time they get done, they'll start a new one.
Yeah.
Well, and of course with the Senate, if the Senate were the thing that bothered me about that whole enterprise, not only with the fact that it was so obviously contrived, but also that all of the virtually entire all of the voting on both sides was by party lines, which means that if they had a few more Democrats in the Senate, that impeachment would have actually happened, and
right.
And it's just outrageous. But we're almost out of time, George, and I want to thank you for coming on board and give you the chance to give us the final thought.
Well, I think maybe my final thought would just be we hear lots of debate in Washington now about opening up the country and so forth, and people will say things like, show me where you have the right to this or that. I think that's the wrong question. I would say, show me where the government has the right to do something, because the Constitution wasn't written to give me rights. It was written to limit the power of government. And so I would hope listeners, anybody who cares about academics and scholarship, would realize if the way the Constitution was written was not to limit your freedom, it was to limit government's power.
You're listening to the Dr. Larry Show on the Batchelor News Radio Network, and it's time to say goodnight, and God bless America.